date is April 2nd, 1989. Inside a sold-out Boardwalk Hall in Atlantic City, 19,000 screaming fans bear witness to a spectacle of unprecedented scale, a clash of titans that transcended mere sport. This was WrestleMania V, the culmination of a year-long narrative arc, a simmering resentment that had finally boiled over into an inferno. In the squared circle, two larger-than-life figures, once inseparable, now stood on the precipice of war. Macho Man Randy Savage, the reigning champion, a whirlwind of intensity and unbridled charisma, and Hulk Hogan, the seemingly indestructible hero, the standard-bearer of Hulkamania, fresh off his cinematic foray into the world of film. This was more than just a championship bout. It was the symbolic fracturing of the megapowers, a betrayal of friendship, and a battle for the soul of the World Wrestling Federation. The tension was palpable, a thick, almost suffocating aura in the arena. Every chop, every slam, every near fall was met with a thunderous roar that threatened to lift the very roof off the building. Hogan, the returning hero, the real champion in the eyes of the masses, was a force of nature, his every flex and gesture met with an explosion of adoration. Savage, fueled by a paranoid jealousy that had been meticulously cultivated by the Federation's master storyteller, Vince McMahon, fought with a desperate ferocity, believing he was defending not just his title, but his very dignity against the encroaching shadow of his former friend. This match, in its dramatic heft and its profound emotional resonance, represented the absolute zenith of the Federation's golden era. It was a perfectly crafted narrative, a crescendo of storytelling that had captured the imaginations of millions, propelling professional wrestling into the mainstream consciousness as never before. The golden era was not just about the larger-than-life characters, it was about the intricate, compelling sagas woven around them, the emotional investments fans made in their heroes and villains. Hogan, in his triumphant reclamation of the championship, stood at the apex of this meticulously constructed universe, a monument to Vince McMahon's visionary ambition. Yet, beneath this gleaming facade of unprecedented success, cracks were forming, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but ultimately profound. The very architect of this empire, Vince McMahon, and his most formidable creation, Hulk Hogan, were on a collision course, a trajectory that would ultimately lead to one of the most significant betrayals in professional wrestling history. This was not a betrayal born of a sudden impulse, but rather a slow, agonizing divergence of ambition, a clash of colossal egos, and a fundamental disagreement over the future of the Federation and the very nature of their symbiotic relationship. To truly understand the real reason Hogan turned on McMahon, one must peel back the layers of kayfabe and narrative, delving into the complex interplay of business, personal aspirations, and a growing sense of perceived injustice. The story truly begins not in the late 1980s, but earlier. Vince McMahon inherited a regional wrestling promotion from his father, Vincent J. McMahon, a territory rooted in the traditional, localized model of the National Wrestling Alliance. Young Vince, however, harbored a far grander vision. He saw professional wrestling not as a series of disparate territories, but as a global entertainment juggernaut, a phenomenon that could transcend geographical boundaries and cultural divides. His strategy was audacious, revolutionary, and deeply disruptive. He would consolidate the industry, buying out or strong-arming rival promoters, leveraging national television, and creating a unified, national, and eventually international brand. To achieve this, he needed a charismatic, marketable figurehead, a larger-than-life hero who could resonate with a mainstream audience beyond the traditional wrestling fanbase. He found that figurehead in Terry Bollea, soon to be known as Hulk Hogan. Hogan, possessing an undeniable charisma and a physique that seemed carved from granite, was the perfect archetype. McMahon rebranded him, gave him the Hulkamania ethos of training, saying prayers and taking vitamins, and unleashed him upon the unsuspecting American public. The synergy was immediate and explosive. Hogan, under McMahon's masterful promotional guidance, became a cultural icon, a marketing phenomenon. He was the face of the Federation, starring in movies, appearing on talk shows, and selling millions of dollars in merchandise. This success, however, sowed the seeds of future discord. Hogan, as the undisputed top star, felt he was directly responsible for the company's unprecedented growth. He viewed himself as a genuine partner in this enterprise, not merely an employee. This perspective, while understandable from his vantage point, often clashed with McMahon's absolute dictatorial control. Vince McMahon, after all, saw himself as the benevolent dictator, the visionary who plucked Hogan from relative obscurity and molded him into a superstar. In his mind, Hogan owed him everything. This fundamental difference in perception regarding their roles would be a constant simmering undercurrent. As the 1980s progressed, Hogan's star power continued to ascend, but so too did his personal aspirations. He wasn't content just to be a wrestler. He saw himself as a mainstream entertainer, an actor, a brand. His foray into Hollywood, beginning with No Holds Barred in 1989, was a significant turning point. While McMahon initially supported this venture, seeing it as another avenue to promote the WWF brand, it also created a new dynamic. Hogan was increasingly spending time away from the wrestling ring, pursuing projects that were not directly under McMahon's purview. This chipped away at the all-consuming singular focus McMahon demanded from his top stars. Furthermore, the financial arrangements became a point of contention. Hogan, believing his star power was directly generating hundreds of millions for the company, felt he wasn't receiving his fair share. While he was undoubtedly well compensated by wrestling standards, the sheer scale of the Federation's revenues at the time led him to believe his slice of the pie should be larger, especially when compared to the earnings of Hollywood actors of similar prominence. This growing financial dissatisfaction was a significant catalyst for his eventual departure. The early 1990s presented a series of existential threats to the Federation, which further exacerbated the underlying tensions. The infamous steroid scandal, ignited by Dr. George Zahorian and later prosecuted by the federal government, cast a dark cloud over the entire industry. Hogan, as the public face of the company and a physically imposing figure, became a primary target of scrutiny. He was called to testify in the federal steroid trial, a grueling and humiliating experience that forced him to publicly admit to steroid use, albeit under medical supervision. This trial and the associated public relations nightmare was a profound psychological blow to Hogan. He felt exposed, vilified, and, critically, that McMahon had not sufficiently protected him. While McMahon himself was under immense pressure and legal threat, Hogan perceived a lack of loyalty and a willingness to sacrifice him to save the company. This sense of being abandoned or thrown under the bus was a deeply personal grievance. Compounding the steroid scandal was a significant decline in business. The wrestling boom of the 1980s had peaked, and audience interest began to wane. Pay-per-view buy rates dropped, live event attendance faltered, and television ratings softened. The public perception of professional wrestling shifted from mainstream entertainment to a more niche, often scrutinized form of entertainment. In this downturn, McMahon began to look for new stars to carry the mantle, recognizing that relying solely on Hogan, whose mainstream appeal was arguably diminishing amidst the controversies, was no longer a sustainable strategy. Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and The Undertaker began to be positioned as the new generation, signaling a gradual yet undeniable transition away from the Hulkamania era. Hogan, accustomed to being the sole main event draw and the undisputed champion, felt his position was being threatened and his value diminished. By 1993, the relationship between Hogan and McMahon had become strained to the breaking point. Hogan's last major run in the Federation saw him controversially reclaim the championship at WrestleMania IX, a move widely criticized by fans and many within the industry. This felt less like a passing of the torch and more like a desperate attempt to cling to the past. Following this brief reign, Hogan eventually dropped the title back to Yokozuna and quietly exited the company. The official narrative was that he was taking a hiatus, but the truth was far more complex. Hogan felt burned out, undervalued, and politically isolated. He believed McMahon had failed to protect him during the steroid scandal, and that his immense contributions to the company were being overlooked in favor of new talent. His desire for more creative control, a larger financial stake, and a renewed sense of respect had gone unfulfilled. The true turning point, the point of no return, came with the emergence of World Championship Wrestling as a legitimate competitor. Under the leadership of Eric Bischoff, WCW began to aggressively recruit disaffected Federation talent. offering lucrative contracts and a fresh start. Bischoff understood Hogan's grievances and shrewdly capitalized on them. He offered Hogan not just a substantial financial package, but also, crucially, creative control, a promise that Hogan would have a significant say in his character, storylines, and overall direction. This was a direct appeal to Hogan's desire for autonomy, something he felt he had been denied in the Federation for years. In 1994, Hogan signed with WCW, a move that sent shockwaves through the wrestling world. This was, in essence, his first overt turn on Vince McMahon. It wasn't a betrayal of a friend in the traditional sense, but a strategic move by a businessman and performer who felt his previous employer had become unsupportive and restrictive. He sought a new environment where his perceived value would be recognized and his creative input would be respected. This move was predicated on a belief that McMahon had taken him for granted, that the symbiotic relationship had become parasitic, with McMahon extracting the bulk of the benefit. However, the most iconic and paradigm-shifting turn came in 1996 at the Bash at the Beach pay-per-view. This was the moment Hulk Hogan, the embodiment of Hulkamania, the paragon of virtue and American heroism, revealed himself as the third man in the New World Order. He dropped his leg on Randy Savage, aligned himself with Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, and delivered a scathing promo, denouncing the fans and embracing his new role as a villain. This wasn't just a heel turn, it was a societal shift within wrestling. Hogan, the hero McMahon built, was now a villain for the very company that sought to dismantle McMahon's empire. This was the ultimate symbolic betrayal. While the NWO turn was a storyline, it was profoundly rooted in Hogan's complex history with McMahon. By turning heel, Hogan was not just embracing a new character, he was, in a way, reclaiming his narrative, shedding the moralistic burden of Hulkamania that had become creatively stifling. He was able to openly express a more cynical, jaded persona, a reflection of the frustrations he had privately harbored for years. This heel turn, orchestrated by Bischoff, allowed Hogan to channel years of pent-up resentment, not just towards the fans who he felt had turned on him during the steroid scandal, but implicitly towards the system, the demands, and the perceived injustices he had faced under McMahon's singular vision. The real reason Hulk Hogan turned on Vince McMahon was not a single event, but a confluence of factors that accumulated over a decade. It was a gradual erosion of trust, a clash of business philosophies, and a deep-seated personal resentment. So in the end, this is a tale of ambition, ego, betrayal, and business. It's the story of a man who saw himself as a co-architect of an empire, but felt treated like just another employee. In turning away from McMahon, Hogan didn't just change companies, he lit a fuse. That decision detonated into the Monday Night Wars, redefined the industry, and transformed wrestling's biggest hero into its most compelling villain. The triumph of Hulkamania had always carried within it the seeds of rebellion, one that would erupt not with a leg drop in the ring, but with a seismic shift behind the scenes.